Wait, what do you do when the universe sends you a princess wrapped in an insult? Kaelen wiped his hands on an oily rag, looking the alien woman up and down with a lopsided grin. The Archon must have a terrible eye for beauty because back in California, you'd be stopping traffic, not rebellions. Make sure to subscribe for more HFY sci-fi tales like this one. Now let's get into the story. The low, persistent hum of a malfunctioning gravlift was the only music in the dimly lit garage, the sound of Kaelen Mercer's world. He was a fixer of things, a solver of problems, a man whose kingdom was defined by the scent of ozone, engine grease, and the dry California dust that settled on every surface. He was elbow-deep in the guts of a Mark IV plasma conduit when the air behind him tore open with a sound like ripping silk. A column of incandescent light, sharp enough to hurt the eyes, split the reality of his workshop for a single heart-stopping second. And from that impossible doorway stepped a woman. Her skin was the deep, polished hue of lapis lazuli, and her eyes held the piercing, intelligent light of sapphires. She was swathed in robes of iridescent silk and intricate metallic filigree that clung to a form that was undeniably soft, generously curved, and wholly out of place. She stumbled once, her feet meeting the concrete floor with a soft thud, her entire posture radiating a discomfort that was both physical and profound. Hovering in the fading portal was the shimmering, disdainful image of a towering, severe-looking being adorned in light. Human mechanic? The voice boomed, echoing with an arrogance that seemed to polish the very air. I present to you my daughter, Princess Lyra of House Solarius. She has proven unsuited to her diplomatic duties. She will learn humility among your kind. And with that final, crushing pronouncement, the portal snapped shut, leaving behind a deafening silence and the faint smell of ozone and expensive perfume. Kaelen blinked, his mind struggling to catch up. He'd been expecting a parts delivery, maybe a stubborn local with a fried engine core. Not this. Not a woman who looked like she was one wrong word away from either shattering into a million pieces or setting his entire shop on fire in a fit of royal pique. He managed, gesturing vaguely at the chaotic sanctuary of his garage. Welcome to Mercer's Marvels and Mechanicals. Try not to trip over everything. Lyra of House Solarius had braced herself for mockery. Her father's court had been a chorus of veiled barbs and condescending smiles as she was led to the translocation gate. Let the human see what a true burden looks like, a courtier had hissed, her voice like poisoned honey. Perhaps among the primitives, she will finally understand her place. She had held her head high until the light died, until she was truly, utterly alone. And now she stood, surrounded by the gritty, tangible reality of a human workshop, the smells of lubricant and hot metal filling her senses, facing a man who didn't seem to know he was supposed to be impressed or repulsed. The garage was a beautiful disaster. Tools hung from pegboards in a system that seemed to make sense only to him. Dismantled drone cores and engine parts created a landscape of metal and wire on every workbench. In the corner, an ancient audio player murmured a soft, melancholic tune from a bygone era. A small, six-legged cleaning unit, shaped vaguely like a terrier, whirred past her feet, bumping into her ankle with a soft beep of apology before scurrying away under a bench. Kaelen watched her take it all in, her sapphire eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. Sorry about the mess, he said, wiping a streak of black grease from his brow with the back of his hand. Wasn't exactly prepped for a royal visitation today. She frowned, a delicate crease forming between her brows. You are not kneeling. He let out a short, genuine laugh. Your Highness, I only kneel for torque wrenches and faulty warp drives. They tend to have catastrophic reactions if you don't show the proper respect. That earned him the faintest, almost imperceptible twitch at the corner of her full mouth. A near smile, quickly and expertly suppressed. Do you have accommodations? She asked carefully, her voice a low, melodic tremor. Got a loft upstairs, he said, nodding towards a narrow, industrial staircase. Was storage. I can clear it out. It's quiet. Has a window with a prime view of the scrapyard and the sunset. Can't beat the sunsets. She followed him up the stairs, her movements hesitant, each step careful on the worn metal treads. Her magnificent, utterly impractical robes whispered against the railing, catching on a protruding bolt. She cursed under her breath in a language that sounded like shifting crystal. Kaelen pretended not to notice. He pushed the door open. The room was starkly simple. A sturdy bed with a faded quilt, a small desk made from a repurposed engine housing, and the faint, ever-present scent of solder and coffee. "It's not a palace," he said, leaning against the doorframe, "but it's yours for as long as you need it." Lyra studied the space for a long, silent moment, her pride warring with her exhaustion. Finally, she sat gingerly on the edge of the bed. The frame let out a low, protesting groan. She froze, mortification washing over her features, turning her blue skin a shade darker. "Hey, easy there," Kaelen said quickly, his hands coming up in a placating gesture. "That frame's older than I am. Been meaning to reinforce it. It's the bed, not you. Promise." Her eyes, wide and shocked, flicked to his face. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't smirking. He looked sincere. "You do not need to comfort me, mechanic. I am aware of what I am." He shifted his weight, the doorframe creaking in sympathy. "Looks to me like you're a person who deserves a bed that doesn't sound like it's dying." She looked down at her hands, twisting in the silk of her lap. "I was told this was to teach me humility, that my form was an embarrassment, that your people would find me excessive." Kaelen let out a low whistle, running a hand through his already messy hair. "Well, whoever told you that has clearly never been to California. Trust me, Lyra, you'd cause a scene. And not just 'cause you literally glow." A warm flush crept up her neck. "You find me appealing?" He stammered, suddenly feeling the heat of the workshop even up here. "I mean, yeah, I've got a pulse, don't I?" He made a vague, helpless gesture towards her. "You look solid, real, like you could shoulder a star drive into place and not even break a sweat. That's a high compliment in my line of work." That got her. A real laugh, small and shaky, but undeniably real. It was a sound like tiny bells. Kaelen grinned, a wave of relief washing over him. "There it is. Was starting to think the Archon sent me a very fancy statue." She shook her head, a strand of her hair, which seemed to be made of fine, dark blue filaments, shifting with the movement. "You are an unusual man, Kaelen Mercer. Unusual pays the bills." As the sun began its descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple over the distant scrap mesas, the automated lights in the garage flickered on. Outside, the low rumble of cargo haulers passing overhead vibrated through the walls. Inside, the two of them stood in a silence that was no longer entirely awkward, filled only by the gentle hum of dormant machinery and their own quiet breathing. For the first time since the light gate had closed, Lyra didn't feel like a punchline. She didn't feel like a punishment. She felt perceived. Later, after Kaelen had retreated downstairs to finally silence the complaining grav lift, he found himself pausing every few minutes, listening for the soft sound of her footsteps in the room above. When he finally powered down the shop for the night, plunging the space into darkness save for the standby lights on various consoles, he caught himself smiling. He had no clue what he was supposed to do with an exiled alien princess, but he was already certain of one thing. He liked the strange, new gravity she brought to his world. The next morning, Kaelen was jolted awake not by his alarm, but by the acrid, unmistakable scent of something burning. He bolted from his cot in the back office, heart hammering against his ribs, and skidded into the main garage to find Lyra standing stiffly by the small kitchenette, holding a smoking pan over the heating coil. Inside was a blackened, charred lump that might have once been an egg. "I attempted to prepare a morning meal," she announced, her voice flat and formal, though her shoulders were slumped in defeat. "Your terrestrial sustenance is less compliant than I anticipated." Kaelen blinked, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he took in the scene. "Yeah, eggs tend to get feisty if you hit 'em with a blast furnace setting. We usually start a little lower on the dial." I calibrated the thermal output according to standard Solarian culinary protocols, she explained, her chin lifting just a fraction in a show of wounded pride. Kaelen snorted softly, taking the pan from her and turning the heat down to a gentle sizzle. Solarian protocols could probably vaporize my countertop. Here, watch the human way. He nudged her gently aside, his movements easy and practiced. Lyra crossed her arms, but she didn't retreat. She watched, her sapphire eyes intent, as he cracked a new egg into the now buttered pan. The sound was softer this time, a friendly hiss, and the smell of burning was quickly replaced by the warm, comforting aroma of butter and cooking food. You perform culinary arts? She asked, curiosity cutting through her defensive posture. Only when starvation is imminent, he replied, flipping the egg with a deft flick of his wrist. Otherwise, the auto-chef handles the dirty work. Lyra's lips curved into the faintest of smiles. You are a strange species. Coming from the woman who materialized out of a hole in space-time, I'll consider that a high compliment. When they sat down at the small, grease-stained table he used for both meals and minor engine repairs, Lyra eyed the slice of toast he'd slathered with strawberry jam with deep suspicion. She poked at it with a fork before finally, cautiously, taking a small bite. Her expression transformed instantly. Her eyes widened, her posture straightening in surprise. It is sweet, she whispered, her voice full of wonder. That's jam, Kaelen said, unable to hide his amusement. You like it. The delicate, tendril-like filaments of her hair twitched with what he was learning was a sign of restrained delight. This flavor, it does not exist in the Solarian Dominion. She took another, larger bite, her demeanor softening into something almost childlike in its pleasure. It is wonderful. Then we'll make sure we're never out, he said, and for a moment, their eyes met across the small table. The simple, domestic normality of it, an alien princess eating jam-smeared toast in a dusty California garage, felt bizarre and yet somehow perfectly right. Over the next few days, a new rhythm established itself in the garage. Lyra, despite Kaelen's half-hearted protests, insisted on making herself useful. She was, to his immense surprise, incredibly meticulous. Her long, elegant fingers, which seemed built for holding scepters, were impossibly deft with a micro-soldering iron, assembling complex circuit boards with a speed and precision that put his own repair drones to shame. Her strength, however, was sometimes a liability. Once, trying to be helpful, she attempted to lift a heavy generator core to save him the trip with the hovercart. The metal workbench beneath it groaned, then buckled with a shriek of protesting metal, sending tools and components clattering to the floor. Well, Kaelen said, brushing a layer of dust from her shoulder. Guess we found the structural weak point. My apology darkening with a flush of blue embarrassment. He just grinned. No, that was honestly impressive. Didn't think that table could bend that way. Note to self, upgrade to Lyra-proof furniture. That earned him a faint, breathy chuckle. In the evenings, when the last customer had left and the bay doors were closed, they would often sit outside on the rusted fire escape that served as his balcony, sharing a pot of strong coffee and watching the stars prick the deep indigo of the California sky. Lyra would gaze upward, her expression unreadable, a profound homesickness etched in the lines of her posture. Do you miss it? Kaelen asked one night, his voice quiet against the hum of the distant city. She was silent for a long time. I miss the idea of it, she said finally. I miss what home was supposed to be. He just nodded, sipping his coffee, giving her the space to continue. My people value perfection, she said, the word tasting bitter on her tongue. Symmetry, a lean, austere form. I was not sculpted to that ideal. The Archon has many daughters. I was the only one who did not fit the mold. Kaelen leaned back, the old metal creaking under his weight. You ever think that maybe the mold is just wrong? She turned to look at him, genuinely perplexed. Wrong. Yeah, he shrugged, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. If your entire species can't appreciate someone who looks like you, that's their failure, not yours. You look healthy, strong, alive. You don't need to be carved out of some cold, distant moon rock to be beautiful. Her throat tightened, an unfamiliar, warm pressure building in her chest. You speak of such things so freely. Others would fear the Archon's wrath for such words. Probably because I have a bad habit of saying what I think. That drew another quiet, sincere laugh from her. Later that week, a pair of local traders, a little too deep into their synth ale, stopped by the shop, their eyes lingering on Lyra with a mix of curiosity and crude appraisal. Heard the stories. One slurred, just loud enough to be heard. Guess they weren't exaggeratin'. That's a whole lot of princess. Lyra froze mid-reach for a hydrospanner, the old, familiar shame washing over her like a cold tide. Before she could retreat into herself, Kaelen looked up from the engine block he was tuning. You two got a problem with my assistant? They smirked, exchanging glances. Just saying, not what we pictured. Then picture the door. Kaelen cut in, his tone calm but edged with something hard and unyielding. Out. They hesitated, the sheer force of his quiet authority cutting through their drunken bravado, and finally shuffled out, muttering under their breaths. The silence they left behind was heavy and thick. Lyra stared at the oil-stained floor. You did not have to defend my honor. Jace leaned against the tool chest, wiping his hands. Wasn't about honor. I just have a zero-tolerance policy for idiots in my workspace. A small, genuine smile touched her lips. You are a terrible liar, Kaelen Mercer. He grinned back. Yeah, I've been told. That night, as he was shutting down the main power grid, he caught a glimpse of her reflection in the dark glass of the upstairs window. She was standing straight, her shoulders back, her head held high in a way he hadn't seen before. Maybe, he thought as he closed the final circuit breaker, his work wasn't just about fixing machines after all. Maybe it was about providing a space where other, more complex things could repair themselves. By the second week, Lyra had officially claimed a corner of the workshop. Kaelen had dubbed it the Royal Suite, though she had sternly renamed it Efficiency Node Theta to sound less sentimental. It was a cleared section of workbench with neatly organized parts bins, a data slate loaded with Solarian technical schematics, and a single, luminous blue flower she had cultivated from a nutrient gel pack in an old coffee mug. Every morning she appeared in a set of practical, dark blue coveralls he'd found for her. The sleeves rolled up, her hair pulled back, faint shimmering trails of cobalt on her temples from the Solarian equivalent of sweat. Kaelen pretended not to notice how the sturdy fabric couldn't quite hide the powerful, graceful curve of her hips, or how the simple outfit somehow made her look more regal than her formal robes ever had. Remind me, he said one morning as she calibrated the emitter on a plasma cutter with intense focus. Wasn't your last job diplomacy? It was supposed to be, she replied, not looking up from her work. But when I attended the inter-system negotiations, the other delegates only wished to discuss my mass, not my mandates. Kaelen's brow furrowed. Their loss. A small, genuine smile played on her lips. Perhaps the galaxy has poor taste. Or maybe they just never met a woman who could out-engineer them. Her laugh, clear and melodic, echoed off the metal walls, a sound that was quickly becoming his favorite part of the day. You flatter too easily, human. Only when I mean it, he said, and the look they shared across the cluttered bench was warm enough to melt solder. They began collaborating on a new project, a hybrid Solarian human power converter that would be cleaner and twice as efficient as anything on the local market. It became their shared obsession. She understood the theory of resonant energy fields. He understood how to make stubborn hardware play nice. Between them, something close to magic happened. Try routing the primary flow through the secondary induction coil, Kaelen suggested, leaning over her shoulder to point at the schematic on her data slate. Her fingers brushed against his as she made the adjustment on the control board. The air in the workshop seemed to tighten, to hum with a new, different kind of energy. Neither of them moved. The converter whined, then settled into a steady, bright hum. It works, she whispered, her voice full of awe. Told you, he murmured, his own voice softer than he intended. You've got a real feel for this. Her cheeks darkened to a deeper shade of blue. It is pleasant to be useful. He looked at her then, really looked, seeing the newfound confidence beginning to eclipse the old embarrassment. Lyra, he said, his tone serious, you've always been useful. You just never had the right garage to prove it. That evening, they celebrated the successful test run with reconstituted noodles and the last of the strawberry jam. Lyra insisted on helping with the cooking again. This time, she declared with mock solemnity, I will not incinerate our sustenance. The bar is on the floor, Your Highness, Kaelen teased. When she managed to boil the noodles to a perfect, springy consistency, she looked absurdly, wonderfully proud. Victory, she announced, holding the pot aloft as if it were a won trophy. Gourmet chef in the making, he said, taking it from her. She tilted her head, her sapphire eyes glinting with curiosity. Does human courtship often involve the repeated sharing of poorly prepared meals? Kaelen nearly choked on his water. Sometimes. Why? Because I find I enjoy it, she said simply. He blinked, his mind momentarily short-circuiting. You're dangerously good at keeping me off balance. The feeling, she replied, a sly smile gracing her lips, is entirely mutual. Later, as a rare, gentle rain began to tap a soothing rhythm on the corrugated metal roof, they found themselves sitting by the half-open bay door, watching the water darken the dusty concrete. The workshop was bathed in the soft, multicolored glow of a dozen half-finished projects. Lyra spoke into the comfortable quiet. My father will forget I exist soon. That was his intention, to make me vanish without the mess of a formal disownment. People like that, Jace said, staring out at the rain-swept yard. They're blind. They sent you here as a punishment. But in 2 weeks, you've optimized my power grid and redesigned my compressor array. She turned to him, her expression tender in the low light. You fix people, Kaelen Mercer, not just machines. He let out a soft, self-deprecating chuckle. Pretty sure I'm better at the second one. No, she said, her voice firm. You simply do not see what you are doing. Her gaze lingered on him, warm and heavy, long enough to make his heart do something uncomfortably, wonderfully human in his chest. Human in his chest. By the 3rd week, the gossip in the dusty California settlement had undergone a subtle but significant shift. The mechanic's got himself a royal assistant. The locals would say at the diner, their tones now leaning more towards impressed than mocking. She's a bit much to handle, but stars. She works harder than any 3 of his drones. Lyra overheard the phrase a bit much from a group of miners, and instead of the old, familiar sting, she found herself smiling. It no longer felt like a condemnation of her form, but an affectionate acknowledgement of her formidable presence. One afternoon, she caught her reflection in the polished casing of a freshly repaired sublight thruster. The same body that had once made her dread mirrors now looked capable, powerful, the curves speaking of strength and resilience rather than failure. She smiled, a real, unforced one, and saw no shame looking back. Kaelen noticed, a grin spreading across his own face as he tightened a fuel line. You're grinning at yourself again. She didn't look away from her reflection. Is that prohibited in this establishment? Mandatory, actually, he said, his voice warm, highly encouraged. She turned, a playful glint in her sapphire eyes, reached for a nearby can of lubricant, and deliberately smeared a small, dark streak across his cheek. Then you should participate. He blinked in mock outrage. Did you just... You are officially filthy now, mechanic? She announced with an air of royal decree. Balance has been restored. He laughed then, a deep, genuine sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floor plates, and the last of her lingering insecurities seemed to dissolve in the warmth of it. That night, their hybrid converter prototype pulsed to life under the blanket of stars, its core glowing with a stable, brilliant blue light. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the quiet of the closed garage, watching the energy ripple through the intricately woven coils. Do you realize? She said softly, her voice full of wonder. We have built something the Archon's own engineers declared a physical impossibility? Kaelen bumped his shoulder gently against hers. Guess that makes us partners. The word hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Partners? She whispered, the term feeling both foreign and perfectly right. The hum of the machine was the only answer, a steady, warm thrum that felt like a promise. The next morning, Lyra was downstairs before him. A first. The workshop was still wrapped in the pre-dawn hush, the only light coming from the standby indicators on various consoles. She had already attempted coffee, the result being a thick, tar-like substance that could have stripped paint. He drank it without complaint, hiding his smile behind the mug. You don't have to keep doing that, you know, he said, his voice still rough with sleep. Doing what? Trying to earn your keep. You're already pulling your weight around here. Figuratively speaking. She narrowed her eyes, a playful suspicion in her gaze. Was that a jest about my density? He raised his hands in surrender, laughing. Nope. Pure compliment. Mechanic's honor. Her lips twitched. Your species is endlessly confusing. You flirt through a combination of flattery and self-deprecation. Yeah, it's kind of our signature move, he admitted. Helps avoid getting punched. The days began to slip into a rhythm that felt dangerously close to permanent contentment. Lyra would hum as she worked, a low, resonant Solarian melody that wove through the clatter of tools like a thread of silk. Sometimes, lost in the task of sorting components, she would forget he was there and begin to move, her hips swaying in a subtle, graceful dance to the old music from his audio player. Kaelen, from across the room, would often stop what he was doing, a wrench frozen in his hand, just to watch the unself-conscious poetry of her movement. When she caught him one afternoon, she stopped abruptly, a flush rising on her neck. You are staring, Kaelen. He didn't even try to deny it. Ah, yeah. I do that sometimes. Do you derive enjoyment from observing me? She asked, her tone a mixture of curiosity and something warmer. He shrugged, aiming for nonchalance and missing by a mile. Can't help it. You move like you belong right here. Her gaze softened, the defensive posture melting away. No one has ever told me I belonged anywhere before. Their lunches became a sacred ritual. They would climb onto the sun-warmed roof of the garage, legs dangling over the edge, sharing rehydrated meal packs and stories. Kaelen told her about his childhood, scavenging parts from the California scraplands to build his first speeder, about his mother who could diagnose an engine's ailment by sound alone. Lyra, in turn, spoke of the Solarian citadels, their spires piercing crystal skies, the halls of harmonic resonance where politics were sung rather than spoken, and how the breathtaking beauty of it all had always felt cold and sterile to her. My sisters were born into perfection, she confessed one day, her voice quiet against the hum of a passing atmospheric shuttle. Each one a masterpiece of genetics and training, polished to a brilliant sheen. I was the miscalculation, the robust one. Kaelen looked at her, his expression utterly sincere. Funny, to me, robust sounds like the highest compliment there is. She tilted her head, genuinely perplexed. Why? Because things that are robust survive, he said simply. They endure. They last. The truth of it hit her with the force of a physical blow. She looked away, but her shoulders trembled not with sorrow, but with the fragile, terrifying tremors of a hope she had long since abandoned. The small frontier town continued to warm to her. Children now waved without hesitation when she walked to the market. The owner of the Soul Bakery had started setting aside a specific, extra sweet pastry for her, claiming she was his best customer. When she laughed, a real, full-bodied sound that was becoming more frequent, people smiled in response. It was as if Kaelen's uncomplicated acceptance had been a contagion of kindness, slowly healing the community's rough edges. Yet old habits died hard. Lyra would still sometimes freeze when she passed a reflective surface, a shop window or a polished hull, bracing for the old self-loathing to rear its head. But the instinctive recoil was fading, replaced by a curious, almost clinical assessment. She was beginning to look at herself not with judgment, but with a dawning sense of ownership. Jace noticed one evening when she emerged from the living quarters in a fitted, dark gray jumpsuit she had altered herself, having abandoned the heavy Solarian robes for good. The sight of her, so confidently and completely herself, struck him with a force that stole his breath. She noticed his silence immediately, her hand going self-consciously to her hip. "Does it not fit correctly?" "It fits," he managed, his voice strangely hoarse. "Almost too well." A slow, knowing smile spread across her face. "Ah, then human standards of modesty are more flexible than I was led to believe." He grinned, recovering some of his composure. "You're lucky I left my filter in engineering school." "I prefer you without it," she replied without a hint of irony, and the casual intimacy of the statement made him fumble the spanner he was holding. The spark that had been smoldering between them was now an open flame, impossible to ignore. A glance held a second too long, a joke that landed a little too close to the heart, the constant, casual tools. It was more than just physical attraction. It was a deep, resonant recognition. One night, a violent electrical storm rolled in from the desert, shaking the garage with peals of thunder. The settlement's power flickered and died, but the hybrid generator in their workshop hummed on, unwavering, its steady blue glow casting long shadows and keeping a half-dozen neighboring homes lit. Lyra leaned in the doorway to the office, watching him monitor the power grid on his main console. "You are glowing again," she said softly. "Just the reflection from the plasma conduit," he replied, not looking up from the screen. "No," she said, her voice firm, "not the machine. You." He finally turned to look at her. Her gaze was unwavering, intense, and full of a tenderness that made his chest ache. They stood there, trapped in the golden blue light of their shared creation, the storm raging outside, neither willing to be the first to break the spell. Then, almost reluctantly, Lyra took a small step back, the moment shattering. "We should rest," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Tomorrow, we must recalibrate the capacitor array." "Right?" he said, forcing a casual grin that felt brittle on his face. "All business. All survival." A faint, sad smile touched her lips. "Precisely." A few days later, the quiet rhythm of their life was shattered by the high-pitched whine of a courier drone descending into the yard. It was a sleek, imperial model, bearing the stark, unforgiving seal of House Solarius. Kaelen found Lyra standing motionless in the center of the workshop, a small, crystalline data sliver glowing ominously in her palm. "What is it?" he asked, though he already knew. She swallowed hard, her knuckles white. "A summons. My father requests an update. He wishes to see proof of my progress." Her voice trembled on the last word, laced with a bitter irony. The Archon's cruel joke had lasted longer than he anticipated, and now he was checking to see how thoroughly his daughter had been broken. Kaelen's jaw tightened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. "Then we'll give him proof," he said, his voice low and steady. "Just not the kind he's expecting." That night, long after Lyra had retreated to a fitful sleep, he remained at his main workbench, the schematics of their generator glowing on the large screen. His own reflection in the dark glass looked back at him, older, wearier, but with a fierce, protective determination burning in his eyes. He didn't know the first thing about interstellar politics or royal decorum, but he knew a bully when he saw one. And this time, he wasn't just fixing a broken engine. He was preparing to dismantle an empire's lie. 3 days later, the sky above the settlement turned a sickly, artificial magenta. The air itself seemed to thicken and hum as a Solarian shuttle, all sharp angles and gleaming pearl-white alloy, descended through the atmosphere. It was a vessel of intimidation, not diplomacy, and its landing gears touched down on the dusty ground outside Mercer's marvels and mechanicals with a disdainful hiss. The entire town stopped to watch. Kaelen wiped his hands on a rag, his expression grim as the shuttle's ramp extended. 2 tall, severe-looking Solarian envoys emerged first, their armor reflecting the California sun with a cold glare. Between them, a holographic emitter flared to life, projecting the towering, imposing image of the Archon himself. Lyra stiffened beside Kaelen before he even glanced her way. He could feel the tremor that ran through her, see her fingers clench. She had shed her royal silks weeks ago, but now, standing there in her practical, grease-stained coveralls, she looked suddenly small again, the weight of a lifetime of judgment pressing down on her. Her chin lifted in a show of defiance, but her voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper. "Father," the word from his lips was a blade, sharp and cold. "It appears you have acclimated to commonality." One of the envoys smirked. The reports were accurate. She has been reduced to a laborer. The small crowd of townsfolk who had gathered muttered in discomfort. Lyra did not look away. "You wished for proof of my progress. I have it." The Archon waved a dismissive, translucent hand. "You were sent to learn humility. I see no lesson learned, only further degradation. Your attire is vulgar. Your physique remains unaltered." Kaelen's jaw clenched so tight he thought his teeth might crack. Lyra's eyes flickered toward him, a silent plea for strength. He gave her a subtle, almost imperceptible nod, the same one he'd give her before testing a volatile power core. Said, "I'm right here." She turned back to the hologram, her voice gaining a shred of its former strength. "Then perhaps your perception is flawed, Father. I have learned more of value in this garage than in all the crystal halls of your court." The Archon's lip curled. "Enlighten me." "Together," she said, gesturing towards the humming workshop behind her. "Kaelen and I have engineered a dual-spectrum power converter. It achieves a stable resonance across human and Solarian bioenergy grids, a feat your own science directorate deemed theoretically impossible." One of the envoys let out a derisive snort. "A human tinkerer accomplished what our foremost scholars could not?" Kaelen took a single step forward, his posture relaxed but his eyes hard. "Tinkerer's one word for it. Visionary co-engineer has a better ring to it, but I'll answer to either." The Archon's gaze, cold and ancient, settled on him. "You speak with remarkable impudence for a mortal. Someone's gotta," Kaelen shot back, "especially when your people are so busy mocking what they're too blind to see. Lyra's the most brilliant engineer I've ever met. You threw her away for not fitting some stupid ideal, but she's the one who's actually built something new. Something that works." Lyra stared at him, stunned by the raw, open defiance. The Archon's hologram seemed to sharpen, his focus intensifying. "And what human do you find so remarkable about my disappointing progeny?" Kaelen met the piercing gaze without flinching. "Everything you think is a flaw. Her strength, her shape, her damn stubbornness. That's what makes her real. You see a failure." "I see." He paused, his voice dropping, imbued with a conviction that silenced the entire yard. "I see perfection." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Lyra's breath hitched, her eyes wide with disbelief. The Archon's tone turned to ice. "You dare." "I dare," Kaelen said, his voice steady as a bedrock. "Because I don't give a damn if you're an Archon or a ghost in a machine. Nobody talks to her like that. Not here. Not ever again." The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the distant cry of a desert bird. The Archon's eyes narrowed to slits. "So, you have chosen to share in her disgrace?" Kaelen folded his arms across his chest, a grease-stained mechanic standing firm before an emperor of the stars. "If standing with her is a disgrace, then I'll wear it like a badge of honor." Lyra felt the words sink into her soul, mending fractures she thought were permanent. She had expected pity, perhaps a token defense, but not this absolute, unshakable faith. Her father's projection regarded her one last time, his expression unreadable. "You have severed your last tie to your bloodline, daughter." "No," she said, her voice quiet but clear as diamond, carrying across the silent yard. She stepped forward, until she was almost nose to nose with the shimmering image. "For myself. And you can no longer take that from me." The Archon's regal composure fractured for a single, fleeting second, a flicker of something that might have been shock, or even a sliver of respect. Then, without another word, The hologram blinked out of existence. The envoys exchanged uneasy glances. One finally found his voice. "This insolence will be recorded and reported to the High Court." "You do that," Kaelen said, hefting a heavy wrench in his hand. "And make sure you spell my name right. Mercer." With an they turned on their heels and marched stiffly back up the ramp into their ship. The crowd, however, did not disperse. They lingered, looking at Lyra with expressions of awe and newfound respect. Someone began to clap, then another. Soon, the dusty yard was filled with the sound of applause, a wave of acceptance from the very people she had been sent to live among as a punishment. Lyra stood frozen, overwhelmed by the tide of emotion. Kaelen turned to her, his voice softening. "You okay?" She nodded slowly, a single, shimmering tear tracing a path through the faint dust on her cheek. "I think I am." "Good," he said, a faint grin touching his lips. "'Cause I've got a feeling this isn't over yet." She laughed through the tears, a shaky, watery sound that was nonetheless full of genuine joy. "You have no idea the trouble you have just invited." "Yeah, well," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. "Guess I'm just built robust, too." The sound of her laughter, real and full-bodied, was the only answer he needed as the Solarian shuttle lifted off, its engine screaming its retreat back into the cold, unforgiving stars. The Solarian shuttle was a shrinking pearl against the vast California sky, but the tension it left behind was a thick, heavy blanket smothering the garage. Lyra didn't move for a long time, her eyes fixed on the empty space where the vessel had been, her arms wrapped tightly around herself as if holding the pieces of her composure together. Kaelen gave her the space, busying himself with the mindless task of reorganizing a tray of plasma conduits, the clatter of metal the only sound in the profound silence. Finally, she exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to carry the weight of a lifetime out of her lungs. "It is over," she whispered, the words more a question than a statement. Kaelen set down a conduit and walked over to her, stopping a respectful distance away. "Yeah," he said, his voice soft. "You just told off an interstellar emperor. Not a bad day's work." A weak, disbelieving laugh escaped her. "I have never seen him speechless before. You may be the only human in history to have achieved that." "I'll add it to my list of achievements," he replied with a gentle smile. "Right under rebuilds quantum drives and makes a mean cup of terrible coffee." Her gaze finally shifted from the sky to him, her sapphire eyes bright with unshed tears and a dawning, fierce pride. "You make the impossible sound so simple." He shrugged, the gesture encompassing their entire workshop, their shared creation. "It kind of is. You built something incredible. You stood up for yourself, and you did it while the most powerful man you know was telling you that you couldn't. That's not simple, Lyra. That's heroic." She tilted her head, the delicate filaments of her hair catching the light. "And you? You faced down an empire for someone who is not even of your species." "Yeah, well," he said, rubbing the back of his neck in that familiar, self-conscious gesture she had come to adore. "Humans have this terrible, wonderful habit of caring about people who deserve a hell of a lot better. Guess I'm just consistent like that." She blinked slowly, as if the words were a physical warmth spreading through her chest. Then she smiled, a faint, soft, breathtakingly beautiful thing. "You are the most illogical, confounding being I have ever encountered." "I get that a lot," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur. "Usually right before someone decides to kiss me." The words hung in the air between them, bold and sincere and utterly unretractable. Lyra froze, her eyes widening, her breath catching in her throat. The generator's steady hum seemed to intensify, painting both their faces in soft pulses of blue and gold. Kaelen, for once, didn't try to backtrack or make a joke. He simply stood his ground, his heart hammering against his ribs, and took a single, small step closer. "Unless," he added, his voice barely a whisper, "Solarian custom has a problem with that." Her answer was a soft, breathless whisper. "It does not." Her hand, strong and warm and trembling just slightly, came up to cradle his cheek. Her fingers traced the smear of grease she had left there earlier, her touch impossibly gentle. "You are a catastrophe," she murmured, her sapphire eyes searching his. "And yet, I am beginning to believe I was meant to find my way to this catastrophe." Kaelen's smile was slow and full of wonder. "Took a few galactic-scale insults to get here, but yeah, you definitely were." Her laugh, then, was real and radiant, breaking the last of the tension, and she closed the small distance between them. Their lips met, soft and tentative at first, then with a growing certainty that felt like coming home. The workshop around them seemed to hold its breath, the very air vibrating with the rightness of it. The generator pulsed brighter in response, resonating with the connection, two different biologies, two different worlds, sinking into one perfect, shared heartbeat. The townsfolk, who had been watching the entire exchange from a respectful distance, erupted into cheers and whistles. Kaelen pulled back first, breathless, his forehead resting against hers. "Pretty sure we just powered the entire West Coast with that." She smiled against his lips, her eyes still closed. Then it was a very efficient kiss. The celebration that spilled out from the garage and into the dusty streets lasted long into the night. People brought out whatever they had: preserved food, homemade music, stories. The hybrid generator powered strings of lanterns that Lyra herself had programmed to glow in a mix of Solarian cerulean and human gold, the colors twisting together in the air, a perfect representation of their union. At the center of it all, Kaelen and Lyra sat side by side on the worn steps of the garage, sharing a single mug of something strong and local. Their fingers intertwined, quiet smiles passing between them as makeshift fireworks. Old engine parts filled with phosphorescent chemicals burst overhead in showers of brilliant sparks. "You realize," Kaelen said, his voice low, "your dad is probably on his ship right now, redecorating the walls with his breakfast." "Let him," Lyra replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "He wanted me to vanish into obscurity. Instead, my name will be on something that changes the energy consumption of two worlds." He raised their joined hands slightly, to the joke that backfired spectacularly. She clinked her half of the mug against his. To the human mechanic who broke an empire's pride with a wrench and a few kind words. Their laughter mingled, the kind of deep, relieved laughter that only comes when the fear has finally burned itself out and all that remains is the quiet, steady ember of joy. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the music had softened to a single, distant guitar, they walked to the edge of the settlement where the desert began its stark, beautiful claim. The air was cool and clean, and the stars were a brilliant, untamed tapestry. No longer symbols of her exile, but beacons of a future she was now eager to shape. Lyra stopped, looking out at the vast, dark landscape. "When I first arrived here," she admitted, her hand tight in his, "I despised this place. The grit, the noise, the relentless sun. I saw it as my prison. And now," she turned to him, her face illuminated by the starlight. "Now it feels like the only true home I have ever known." Kaelen squeezed her fingers. "Told you. Sometimes the things everyone else has thrown away just need someone to believe they're worth something." Her eyes shimmered with emotion. "I was not broken, Kaelen Mercer." He smiled, a soft, private smile just for her. "I know. You were just waiting for someone to see you." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the faint, steady hum of their generator in the distance, a comforting heartbeat syncopated with their own. "You will never fully understand what you have given me." He chuckled softly. "Coffee and a whole lot of trouble?" She looked up at him, her expression utterly serious and full of love.
"No."
"A reason to stay." The stars wheeled overhead, silent and eternal. Behind them, the workshop glowed with a light that was neither royal nor imperial, but something far more powerful, something real. And for the first time in her life, Lyra of House Solarius didn't feel like she had to beg for a place to belong. She was already home. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. The story of the exiled princess and the mechanic spread through the frontier networks like plasma fire. Their quiet settlement, once a forgotten on the map, found itself on the galactic stage. News crews, curious tourists, and most importantly, engineers and investors began to arrive, all wanting to see the woman who had humbled the Archon and the generator that had made it possible. Kaelen hated the spotlight. He grumbled about the lack of peace and quiet, about the constant interruptions to his work. Lyra, to his surprise, handled it with a grace that was innate, a relic of her royal upbringing that she now wielded on her own terms. She gave no grand speeches, but her quiet confidence as she explained their work was more compelling than any political decree. One day, a courier drone arrived, this one bearing the official seal of the Solarian Science Directorate, not the Imperial House. Lyra opened the crystalline message cylinder while Kaelen was untangling a nest of fiber-optic cables. Her eyes scanned the text, widening in disbelief. "They are petitioning to license our converter design," she said slowly, as if reading the words in a dream. "Officially." Kaelen paused, a cable in each hand. "You mean the same directorate that called our schematics a charming folktale?" "The very same." A slow, triumphant grin spread across his face. "Guess we're a persistent kind of folktale." She looked at him, that familiar, tender admiration shining in her eyes. "You truly do not grasp the magnitude of what you have done." "I fixed a thing, Lyra. That's all." "No." She stepped closer, her voice soft but fierce. "You fixed me. You gave me back the part of my soul that believed I was allowed to take up space, to be seen, to be loved." Kaelen tried to deflect with a joke, but the words caught in his throat. He simply reached out and took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "Hey," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I just like the view." Their evenings on the rooftop now held a different quality. The settlement below them was brighter, busier, humming with a new energy they had directly fueled. One night, Lyra brought out a data slate and set it between them on the old blanket they used. "Do you wish to see something ironic?" she asked, a playful smile on her lips. "How ironic are we talking? Judge for yourself." She tapped the screen, pulling up a news feed from the Solarian core worlds. The headline glowed, "Imperial Energy Reformation Initiative announced. New standards inspired by exiled princesses' work." Kaelen let out a low whistle. "You're a trending topic on the hypernet, Your Highness." Lyra's chuckle was rich with satisfaction. "My father must be apoplectic." "Nah," Kaelen said, nudging her with his shoulder. "I think he's secretly proud and just too stubborn to ever say it." "Perhaps," she conceded, leaning into his touch. "But I no longer require his pride." She looked up at him, her love for him plain in her gaze. "I have found something infinitely more valuable." He smirked. "Please don't say I'm a replacement father figure. That would really kill the mood." Her laughter was immediate and joyous, spilling out into the night air. "No, Kaelen Mercer. You are not my father. You are my partner." He froze, the words settling deep in his heart, then smiled a slow, sure smile. "Yeah," he said, "I can definitely live with that." They continued to build, their partnership deepening with every new project. Their designs, always bearing both their names, began to spread beyond the human frontier. Solarian merchants sold them under the name the Concordance Core. And with the technology, the story spread. The Archon's obese daughter, and the human who saw only perfection. It began as a whisper, a curious fable. Then it became a symbol. On Solarian worlds, women started to quietly, then loudly reject the ancient aesthetic standards. Artists began sculpting new forms, celebrating strength and vitality over frail symmetry. The change was slow, but it was real. A cultural tremor started in a dusty California garage. One afternoon, Kaelen caught a group of Solarian tourists, their forms tall and slender, taking pictures of him as he welded a new exhaust port. He leaned close to Lyra, who was reviewing a schematic beside him. "Think they're here for me?" he muttered. "Undoubtedly," she replied, her face a perfect mask of solemnity. "Your fame precedes you." "Right, thought so." She nudged him gently, her smile breaking through. Your ego has expanded considerably since my father's visit. His grin was unrepentant. Yours should too. You earned it. At night, when the last light was extinguished and the settlement slept, they would sit together on the old couch in the loft, her head on his shoulder, her hand in his. The silence between them was never empty. It was filled with the quiet hum of their creations below and the profound peace of two souls who had finally found their harbor. The steady pulse of their machinery was the heartbeat of a new world, a world they were building together, one act of defiance, one act of love at a time. A year turned on its axis, marked not by formal calendars but by the accumulation of grease-stained schematics, the quiet rhythm of shared sunsets on the roof, and the deepening, unshakable bond between the mechanic and the princess. The stars continued their indifferent march, but the settlement, now officially dubbed Concord's Crossing on regional charts, pulsed with a life it had never known. The Solarian Empire, in its vast and ponderous way, had begun to adapt. The Science Directorate's historic decree officially naming the Concordance Core a transcultural innovation of the highest order was more than just a licensing agreement. It was a silent, seismic surrender. For the first time in recorded history, a technology co-created by a human bore the official seal of the Solarian Empire. The Archon did not sign the decree himself, but his lack of a veto spoke volumes. It was a silence that Lyra understood perfectly, a concession more meaningful than any apology. She never returned to the crystal spires of Solaris Prime, though invitations began to arrive with increasing frequency, from guild masters, ministers, even former courtiers who now tripped over themselves to praise her vision. She declined every one. "I already have an empire," she would say, her gaze sweeping fondly over the cluttered, humming workshop. "It leaks hydraulic fluid and argues with me about torque settings, but it listens when I speak." Kaelen looked up from beneath the chassis of a heavily modified hover truck. "Does this empire of yours offer paid vacation? Or at least dental?" "Never," she replied, a smile in her voice. "But the benefits package includes excellent company." Their life had settled into a comfortable, vibrant cadence. Mornings began with coffee, hers still too strong, his now brewed to a palatable compromise. Their workday was a symphony of clattering tools, shared ideas, and the easy, comfortable silence of two people who understood each other without words. Even their arguments, usually over the most efficient routing of a power conduit or the structural integrity of a housing unit, felt like a form of collaboration, a dance of intellects that always ended in a better design and, often, shared laughter. They walked together through the bustling bazaar that had sprung up around their success, where she was no longer princess but Lyra, the brilliant engineer who always had time to explain a complex principle to a curious child. Kids would run up to her, clutching broken toys or simple circuits, their eyes wide. "Can you fix it? Like you fixed the big one?" they would ask, and she would always kneel, her sapphire eyes crinkling at the corners, and say, "Let us see what we can do together." One afternoon, Kaelen caught her standing still before the polished chrome flank of a newly arrived starship, her reflection staring back at her. It was the same hesitant pause he remembered from her first weeks, but the energy was different now. She wasn't bracing for impact. She was simply observing. When he asked what she was thinking, she didn't look away from her reflection. "It is strange," she mused, her voice thoughtful. "For so many cycles, I tried to make myself smaller, to occupy less space, to be less of a presence. Now," she continued, a slow, confident smile spreading across her face, "I find I rather enjoy seeing how much of the world I can fill." He grinned, slipping an arm around her waist and pulling her close, their reflection becoming a single entity in the shiny metal. "Told you, takes a big presence to run an empire." That night, they sat on their rooftop perch, watching the intricate dance of trade ships and passenger liners gliding between the stars, their navigation lights like a swarm of benevolent fireflies. "Prime." Kaelen handed her the decoder. "Your call," he said simply. The hologram that flickered to life was the Archon himself. He looked older, the lines on his face more deeply etched, his regal posture seeming less like power and more like a burden. For a long moment he said nothing, his ancient eyes studying his daughter, seeing not the failed heir but the woman she had become. "I have observed the changes you have instigated," he began, his voice lacking its former thunder, replaced by a weary resonance. "Our people, they speak your name now with respect, with admiration." Lyra waited, silent and calm, her hand finding Kaelen's and holding tight. "I cannot retract the words I spoke to you," he continued, the admission clearly costing him a great deal. "But I can learn from their error. The next generation will not be taught to feel shame for the strength of their form. That is a lesson I have learned, however belatedly." It was not an apology. It was something perhaps more valuable, an acknowledgement. "Thank you, Father," Lyra said, her voice clear and steady. "That is all I ever wanted." The transmission ended, the light fading from the emitter. Kaelen looked over at her, seeing the quiet peace in her expression. That sounded suspiciously like closure. She smiled faintly, leaning her head against his shoulder. "Perhaps, though it feels less like an ending and more like a new equation whose variables are finally balanced." He nudged her playfully. "You and your math metaphors. You and your grease stains. Hey, they're badges of honor. Then wear them proudly, human mechanic." "I do," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper near her ear. "Especially the ones you leave on me." The settlement decided to throw a festival to mark the first anniversary of the Concordance Core network going fully operational. The mayor, a grizzled former prospector, practically begged Lyra and Kaelen to be the ones to officially open the celebrations. She tried to refuse. "I am an engineer, not a politician." "Too late," Kaelen said, laughing as he gently pulled her onto the central stage that had been erected in the town square. "You're the co-founder of half this planet's power grid. You don't get to hide in the garage anymore." When the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky deepened to velvet, he handed her the master activation lever for their newest, most powerful generator model, one capable of powering the entire settlement and its growing spaceport. "Your turn," he said, his voice full of pride. Lyra took a deep breath, her fingers closing around the cool metal. She looked out at the sea of faces, human and a growing number of other species, all looking back at her with hope and excitement. With a smooth, decisive motion, she pulled the lever down. The night erupted, not with noisy explosions, but with brilliant, silent arcs of gold and cerulean light that leaped from emitter towers, weaving together in a complex, beautiful lattice high above them, a testament to the harmonious fusion of their two technologies. The crowd erupted in a joyous roar that shook the very ground. Children shrieked with delight, their faces turned up to the dazzling display. The deep, resonant hum of the new generator filled the air, a steady, powerful heartbeat that promised a brighter future. She turned to Kaelen, her eyes shining with tears of joy. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. "The noise? The life?" He smiled, his own heart too full for words, and simply slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her close as they watched the sky paint itself in celebration. "Yeah," he finally managed, his voice rough, "to their garage." The familiar scent of ozone and oil was a welcome perfume. A single lamp cast a warm, golden pool of light over their main workbench, where the preliminary schematics for their next project, a FTL comms array that could bridge the gap between human and Solarian space without time lag, lay scattered, a mess of potential and promise. Kaelen leaned back in his chair, the old leather creaking a familiar tune, and watched her. She was already tinkering with a secondary circuit board, her brow furrowed in concentration, a stray filament of dark blue hair falling across her face. The sight of her, here, in their home, filled him with a sense of rightness so profound it was almost painful. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked, his voice soft in the quiet room. She glanced up, her smile immediate and effortless. "You mean, besides you attempting to cook dinner and setting off the fire suppression system again?" "I mean the big picture," he clarified, gesturing vaguely at the stars visible through the skylight. She set her microsoldering iron down with a quiet click and walked over to him, placing her hands on his shoulders and leaning down until their foreheads touched. Next, she said, her voice a whisper, we keep building, not for approval, not for pride, not for an empire. We build for the sheer, unadulterated joy of it. He nodded, reaching up to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking the soft, warm skin. Sounds about perfect. Lyra leaned down further, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to his forehead. You fixed machines, Kaelen Mercer, she murmured against his skin. But you helped mend a galaxy, too. One stubborn, kind, illogical act at a time. He caught her hand, holding it tightly against his cheek, his eyes closed, just breathing in the moment. Guess I'll keep at it, then. You must, she said, her tone leaving no room for argument, yet filled with infinite tenderness. There will always be something worth saving. Outside, the stars blinked in the clear night sky, countless pinpricks of light in an endless dark. And for the first time in the long, often divided history of both their species, human and Solarian vessels now flew under a shared, standardized transponder signal, its pulse pattern an exact copy of the resonance frequency of the concordance core. It had become a universal symbol of connection. Imperfect, messy, stubborn, and infinitely hopeful. And somewhere in the warm, messy heart of that quiet revolution, in a California garage filled with the sounds of laughter, the scent of coffee and solder, and the constant, comforting hum of machinery, a human mechanic and an alien princess kept working, side by side, their hands and hearts intertwined. They were a perfectly mismatched pair, and they were, in every way that truly mattered, perfectly, completely right. Because sometimes the galaxy doesn't change because of a grand war or a royal decree. Sometimes it changes because a single person looks at another, sees past every label and expectation, and says with absolute, unshakable certainty, you are enough. You are more than enough. You are everything. The festival's echoes had faded, replaced by the steady, productive hum of a settlement embracing its newfound destiny. Concord's crossing was no longer a frontier outpost. It was a beacon, and its light drew more than just the curious and the ambitious. It drew the desperate. A ship, not of Solarian design nor any human make Kaelen recognized, limped into the orbital approach, its hull scarred by particle weapon fire and trailing a faint, ominous cloud of coolant. Its distress signal was weak, a repeating loop in a guttural, clicking language that the universal translator struggled to parse. They didn't land at the new, bustling spaceport. Instead, the pilot, following old, instinctual codes of the frontier, set the battered freighter down right outside Mercer's Marvels and Mechanicals, the place everyone whispered was where miracles happened. Kaelen and Lyra were calibrating the new FTL comm array when the shadow of the vessel fell over the open bay doors. They stepped out into the dusty yard, Lyra's hand instinctively going to the multi-tool on her belt, Kaelen's posture shifting from engineer to protector. The ship's ramp lowered with a pained groan, and a being emerged. It was tall, insectoid, with a chitinous shell of iridescent black, multiple limbs, and large, compound eyes that reflected the California sun in 1,000 fractured pieces. It moved slowly, one of its upper limbs clutched protectively against its thorax, a viscous, greenish fluid slowly dripping from a crack in the carapace. It clicked and chittered, and the translator on Kaelen's wrist finally stuttered to life. Sanctuary, pursued. They break the worlds. The creature, a XYL, collapsed onto the dust. Lyra was moving before Kaelen could process the scene. Her medical training from a royal upbringing she'd rejected now surging to the fore. "Help me get him inside," she commanded, her voice calm and authoritative. "Now, Kaelen." They managed to half-carry, half-drag the surprisingly heavy being into the workshop, laying him gently on a cleared workbench normally reserved for engine blocks. Lyra began a swift assessment, her hands gentle but sure as she examined the injury. Kaelen stood by, feeling useless, his mind racing. "Pursued," he muttered, his eyes darting to the sky. Who's pursued? What did he mean? They break the worlds. Lyra didn't look up from her work, using a laser scalpel from his medkit to carefully clean the wound. Questions can wait. Stabilization cannot. I need the biosealer, the industrial grade, and the portable power cell. His physiology is robust, but he is losing vital fluids. They worked in tandem, a seamless extension of their partnership. Kaelen, the problem solver, adapted human technology to alien biology, rigging a power transfer that wouldn't overload the XYL system. Lyra, with her innate understanding of energy flows and biological resonance, directed the repairs with a precision no human doctor could match. As the biosealer hissed, knitting the chitin back together, the XYL's clicking subsided into a pained but coherent stream. His name was Zorvak, and he was a scout. His people, the XYL, were refugees, their crystalline homeworld systematically shattered by a relentless, nameless fleet that harvested planetary cores for fuel, leaving behind barren, broken asteroids. He had been sent to find help, or at least a place to hide. The swarm, they are called. Zorvak clicked, his translator imbuing the words with a chilling finality. They do not communicate. They do not negotiate. They only consume. They are coming. This direction. The story sent a cold dread through Kaelen. This wasn't about pride or aesthetics or cultural change. This was about survival on a galactic scale. The quiet revolution they had started in their garage was about to be tested by absolute mindless destruction. Lyra finished her work, her expression grim. "You are safe here for now," she told Zorvak, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Your ship will be shielded. Your presence will remain a secret." Once Zorvak was resting, they retreated to the rooftop, the starry sky now feeling menacing. "He can't stay," Kaelen said, the words tasting like ash. "If this swarm is tracking him." "I know," Lyra interrupted, her gaze fixed on the heavens. "But we cannot turn him away. We are not that kind of people. You taught me that." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "So what do we do?" "We're mechanics, Lyra. We fix things." "How do you fix a galaxy-eating swarm?" She turned to him, and in her sapphire eyes he didn't see fear. He saw the same fierce, determined light he'd seen when she faced her father. "We do not fix them. We outbuild them. We outsmart them." The idea was audacious, insane, but it was the only one they had. The next few days were a frantic, clandestine whirlwind. They moved Zorvak's ship into a camouflaged hangar they'd once used for experimental engine tests. Using the XYL's detailed scans of the swarm's vessels, they began to analyze the enemy's technology. It was brutally efficient, powerful, but it had a weakness. It was homogeneous. Every ship, every weapon, every system was identical, a perfect, unthinking copy. Couldn't adapt. They, however, could. Their work on the FTL-COM array was repurposed. Instead of sending messages, they designed a resonance pulse, a weapon of sorts, but one that didn't destroy. It was based on the core principle of the concordance core, harmonizing disparate energies. This pulse, they theorized, would introduce a chaotic, unpredictable energy signature into the swarm's unified network, overloading their simple, interconnected systems, causing them to short-circuit, to turn on each other, to become a chaotic mess instead of a unified whole. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble conceived in a California garage. They worked until their hands were raw and their eyes burned, fueled by coffee, determination, and the terrified clicks of their new friend. They integrated XYL crystalline technology with Solarian resonance theory and human brute force engineering, creating a device that looked like a jumbled mess of parts but held the potential to save countless lives. They called it the Cacophony Core. The alert came 2 weeks later. Zorvak's long-range sensors, patched into their workshop systems, picked up the swarm's advanced fleet. A wave of destruction, hundreds of ships strong, was moving through a nearby uninhabited system, and its trajectory would bring it to the outskirts of human-explored space within days. Concord's crossing, with its new power grid and growing reputation, would be a shining beacon, a prime target. They had one chance. Kaelen looked at Lyra, at the smudges of fatigue under her eyes, at the set of her jaw. "This is it," he said quietly. "We either add saving the sector to our resume, or we become a very interesting footnote in history." She took his hand, her grip firm. "We do not become footnotes." The plan was reckless. They would take the Cacophony Core, installed in the heavily modified and shielded hull of Zorvak's freighter, and fly out to meet the swarm. They would get close, dangerously close, and activate the pulse. It was a suicide mission. The entire settlement gathered as they prepared to leave. There were no cheers this time, only a tense, fearful silence. The mayor shook Kaelen's hand, his eyes full of a gratitude too deep for words. Children clung to Lyra's coveralls, their small faces pale. Zorvac stood by the ship's ramp, his injuries mostly healed, his posture one of unwavering solidarity. "My debt is eternal," he clicked. As they climbed the ramp, one last look at the garage, at the home they had built together. He memorized the sight of it, the messy, beautiful chaos, the light in the window of their loft. Lyra's hand found his. "For home," she said. He nodded, his throat too tight to speak. "For home." The flight into the blackness of deep space was the longest of their lives. The swarm fleet appeared on their scopes as a solid, advancing wall of red icons, blotting out the stars. It was a sight meant to induce despair, a cosmic locust swarm. They powered down everything non-essential, running silent, a speck of dust moving toward a hurricane. The lead swarm vessel was a monstrous thing, a jagged shard of dark metal the size of a small moon, its surface crawling with smaller attack craft. This was the nexus, the brain of this particular fleet. They had to hit it directly. Alarms blared as they were detected. Swarm fighters broke formation, streaking toward them, their weapons charging with a malevolent green glow. "Now, Lyra!" Kaelen yelled, wrestling with the controls, jinking and weaving through a storm of plasma fire. Lyra's hands flew over the console they had built together, her face a mask of concentration. She initiated the startup sequence for the cacophony core. The freighter shuddered, the power draw so massive it nearly overwhelmed their shields. At the heart of their ship, the core began to glow, not with a harmonious blue, but with a chaotic, blinding white light, a visual representation of discordant sound. Activating in 3, 2, 1. She slammed the final command home. There was no explosion, no grand burst of light. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, on the view screen, the lead swarm ship stuttered. Its smooth, predatory grace faltered. A ripple of erratic energy, visible as a distorting wave, spread out from it, washing over the nearest vessels. The green glow of their weapons systems flickered, died, then reignited in violent, unpredictable colors. One ship veered wildly, crashing into its neighbor. Another began firing indiscriminately, its beams slicing through its own fleet. The perfect, silent formation descended into a silent, chaotic ballet of self-destruction. The cacophony was working. It wasn't destroying them with force. It was unmaking them with confusion. Kaelen didn't wait to watch the full effect. He spun the ship around, pushing the engines to their limit, racing away from the disintegrating armada. Behind them, the swarm fleet was turning in on itself, a mindless beast finally given a thought, and that thought was chaos. They had done it. They had won. In the sudden, ringing silence of the cockpit, lit only by the console lights and the distant, fading fireworks of a dying fleet, Kaelen and Lyra looked at each other. There were no words. There was only the shared, breathless reality of survival, and the profound, terrifying knowledge of what they were capable of when they stood together. They weren't just mechanics or princesses anymore. They were guardians, and their garage was the most important workshop in the galaxy. The return to Concord's Crossing was not a victory parade. It was a somber, silent homecoming. The modified XYL freighter, now scarred not just from its previous battles but from the sheer energy backlash of the cacophony core, settled onto the familiar, dust-covered ground outside the garage with a final, exhausted sigh of its straining engines. Kaelen cut the power, and in the sudden, profound quiet, the only sound was the rhythmic tink-tink-tink of overheated metal cooling. He looked over at Lyra. Her hands were still resting on the console, her knuckles white, her gaze turned inward, staring at nothing. The weight of what they had just done, the sheer cosmic scale of it, was a physical pressure in the cockpit. They hadn't just fixed a machine or stood up to a bully. They had unraveled an armada. They had redirected the course of a galactic threat. They had taken lives, even if those lives belonged to a mindless swarm. The moral calculus of it was a burden they would carry forever. "Lyra," he said, his voice hoarse. She blinked slowly, then turned to him, her sapphire eyes haunted but clear. "We are home," she whispered, as if confirming it for herself. He simply nodded, reaching out to cover her hand with his. It was cold. They descended the ramp to find not a cheering crowd, but a reverent one. The entire settlement had gathered, but they stood in silence, their faces etched with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and a new, sober understanding of their place in the universe. They had been saved, but they now knew the price of that salvation. The mayor stepped forward, his usual bluster gone, replaced by a deep, respectful gravity. He didn't offer a speech. He simply bowed his head, first to Lyra, then to Kaelen. It was more powerful than any medal or ceremony. Zorvac was there, his iridescent chitin reflecting the morning sun. He clicked softly, the translator emitting a single, profound sentence. "The debt of my people is now unpayable. You have given us a future." In the days that followed, the story spread, but it was different this time. It wasn't a fable about a princess and a mechanic. It was a stark report of a near-extinction event averted. Official communiques arrived from both the Human Frontier Alliance and, most startlingly, the Solarian Empire. They weren't invitations or licensing agreements. They were requests for consultation, for defense planning, for technological sharing. The Archon's message was brief and direct, addressed to Lyra of Concord's Crossing. It acknowledged the threat and formally requested an alliance, offering the full resources of the Imperial Science Directorate. The little garage was now the de facto headquarters of a new, unofficial coalition. Kaelen and Lyra retreated into their work, not as an escape, but as a necessity. The cacophony core had worked, but it was a blunt, dangerous instrument. They needed to refine it, to understand it, to build safeguards. Their new project, undertaken with a grim determination, was the Harmony Shield, a planetary defense system based on the same principles but designed to create a protective resonant bubble, a field of organized chaos that would confuse and repel any swarm vessel that came too close. It was their penance and their promise. One evening, a month after their return, they stood on the roof, watching the first of the new shield emitters being installed on the settlement's perimeter. The setting sun painted the sky in fiery hues, a stark contrast to the cold, blue glow of the emerging defense grid. "It is a different galaxy now," Lyra said softly, her hand finding his. "It is," Kaelen agreed, lacing his fingers through hers. "But we're still in it. Together." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "I do not wish to be a soldier, Kaelen, or a general." "I know," he said, pulling her closer. "We're builders. That's all we've ever been. To build stronger now." The pressure from the outside galaxy was immense. Delegations, military advisors, and scientists from a dozen species now found their way to Concord's Crossing, all wanting a piece of the genius that had saved them. Kaelen and Lyra handled it with a unified front of polite, firm resistance. They would share their knowledge, they would help build the shields, but they would not be co-opted. Their home, their workshop, would remain their own. It was their sanctuary, the bedrock upon which everything else was built. One night, as a soft rain began to fall, tapping a gentle rhythm on the roof, they were inside, working on the core logic of the shield's control system. The workshop was warm and bright, filled with the familiar, comforting smells of their life together. The audio player was on, murmuring the same old, melancholic tunes. Lyra, tracing a circuit path on a large datapad, began to hum along, her hips swaying slightly in that unconscious, graceful dance she did when she was lost in thought. Kaelen watched her, the sight filling him with a love so fierce it was almost painful. This was why they fought. The right to have this simple, ordinary moment. She caught him looking and smiled, a real, unguarded smile that reached her eyes, erasing the lingering shadows of their recent trauma. "You are staring again, mechanic." "I'm admiring the architecture," he countered, a grin spreading across his face. "It's a classic design." Her laugh was the best sound in the universe. It was the sound of resilience, of joy stubbornly refusing to be extinguished. They finally finished the prototype shield control unit late one night, the central module pulsing with a soft, stable, golden light, a combination of Solarian blue and human yellow, a light that promised protection, not chaos. Exhausted but triumphant, they collapsed onto the old couch in the loft, Lyra's head nestled in the crook of Kaelen's arm. "We did it," she murmured, her voice thick with sleep. "We built a wall that sings." He pressed a kiss into her hair. "Yeah, and it's a damn good song." He held her as she drifted into a peaceful sleep, her breathing slow and even. He stayed awake for a long time, just listening to the sound, watching the golden light of the module cast soft shadows on the walls. Outside, the stars were still there, countless and ancient. The swarm was still out there somewhere. The politics and the pressures would not cease. But here, in this room, with the hum of the garage below and the weight of the woman he loved in his arms, there was a peace that no external force could shatter. They had faced down an empire and a swarm, and they had won not by becoming conquerors, but by remaining exactly who they were. A mechanic who saw value in what others discarded, and a princess who learned that her greatest strength was her own unapologetic self. The galaxy was vast and often cruel, but it had also brought them together. And as long as they stood side by side, with grease on their hands and a stubborn belief in the power of building things rather than breaking them, they knew they could face whatever came next. They had built a haven, not just for themselves, but for anyone who believed that compassion and courage could be the most powerful forces in the universe. Thanks for listening. Subscribe for more heart-filled human stories.